and welcome to a new course. I'm Grandmaster Damian Lemos, and in this one we'll talk about the King's Indian defense for black. So as I do in every single course record, I'll start with an intro and then we'll start analyzing games and also all of the lines white can play, in this case against the King's Indian defense. So the King's Indian arises after d4. Black plays knight f6, white plays c4, we go g6, white goes for knight c3, he wants to build up a powerful center playing e4, and here is where we decide to go for a King's Indian playing bishop to g7. If we play d5, that would be a Grunfeld defense. If we play bishop g7, we go for a King's Indian. And one thing I have to mention about the King's Indian, I've been playing the King's Indian for years. It was my main defense when I started playing chess, I'd say from the age of 12 till I became a Grandmaster at 18. And I think it's a nice weapon to have in your repertoire as black, because when you play against d4, it's not easy to create imbalances, it's not easy to fight for a win as black. When you play the King's Indian, you're guaranteed a game, a middle game with a lot of action. So we've got, after bishop g7, we've got a lot of lines to analyze. I'll mention a few, and we'll see, of course, every possibility white can play, and we'll mention them as we move chapter by chapter. So, in a nutshell, after bishop g7, white usually goes e4. He builds up this powerful center, and as black we play d6. We want to make sure e5 is not playable for white. We'll analyze that later on. But after d6, white has a lot of systems. One of them is to play knight f3 followed by bishop e2. He can play something like knight f3 followed by h3. He can play bishop e2 and bishop g5. He can play the 4 pawns attack, playing f4. What am I missing here? Knight g2, knight g3. So that's just to name a few systems white can play against the King's Indian. There are other ideas as well, and as I mentioned earlier, we'll analyze them on the fly as we go line by line. On top of e4, white can play alternative systems, one of them being a key and main line, which is the fianchetto system, playing knight f3 and g3. That's usually without an early e4. Then he can play knight f3 and bishop f4, or knight f3 followed by bishop g5, which is actually the first line we'll analyze in this chapter. So, as you can see, many lines white can play, and I haven't mentioned all of them. I mentioned probably 80% of all of the lines white can play against King's Indian. So, the last thing I'll say in this little intro is that the King's Indian defense is a defense you have to know as black, because not only you'll learn a weapon to play against d4 as black, you'll learn a lot about chess in general. There are a lot of positional things you need to know in order to play the King's Indian. It's been played by legends of the game like Garry Kasparov, Magnus Carlsen, Bobby Fischer, and many other very strong players. So, without further ado, let's get started. So let's analyze right from the get-go here. d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight to c3, bishop g7. So here we'll start off with the bishop g5 system. So white plays knight f3, we castle. Here we could play d5, transposing into a Grunfeld. If you're a Grunfeld player, then you can benefit of this move order because white already played knight f3. But that aside, we're King's Indian players, so we'll castle short. And here is where e4 happens to be the the main line that would be transposing into the main line, we'll see the bishop g5 system. So this is an interesting approach from white. It's played a lot online, I've noticed, because after bishop g5 we get this queen d2 idea, sometimes queen c1, then he goes bishop h6, and white tries attacking on the king side. So here I'll throw in the first concept I've learned over the years playing the King's Indian defense as black. Usually when white goes for an attack with queen d2, queen c1, bishop h6, it's almost never a checkmate. I mean, he can try queen d2, bishop h6, can even try h4, h5, but that rarely works. If we know what we're doing as black, we'll have a lot of resources to fight against that plan. And the other key concept, as we'll see, is that when he attacks on the wing, usually we have to counterattack in the center. So after bishop g5, here I'll show you first what black usually plays in the King's Indian, and then I'll show you how flexible the King's Indian is and what I think the best line is for us. So what black usually does is d6, knight b7, and then black goes for something like e5. That is the standard way to play the King's Indian. Now, the line I'll recommend is, since he played a subline, we don't have to go for something like e5. We can instead, be flexible as black and play something like c5. We can go for a Benoni approach. Why? Because we got the bishop out early in the game, and we can make the most out of the g7, b2 diagonal. So we'll play c5, and here is where white has to make a decision. What should white play here? Well, the most natural move for for white, is to play d5 to gain some space in the center. Now, e3 is another move we'll analyze, and maybe d takes c5. I don't think d takes c5 is good, because this opens the g7, b2 diagonal. We can simply play something like knight to a6. We're likely to get the pawn back. We can play d6. We can even post knight on e4. We can tell we've got a lot of counterplay on the queen side. Since we haven't moved our pawn on e7, there's no pin, so essentially we might be even better as black here already. Let's say he goes something like e3, I take, bishop e2. Now d6 followed by bishop e6, rook c8 is something I really like. Here we can do even better than that. We can exploit the fact he played an early bishop g5 by playing knight f, e4. Here we're clearly better. No threats on this diagonal. We attack the bishop. We also attack the knight on c3. So if he takes, we take. And here we see white is in trouble. b2 is hanging, so it's bishop g5. There might be something like queen a5 check, and we might win a piece as well. So we see white has to be precise right from the get-go after c5. So d takes c5, we can tell that's not aggressive, it's not a challenge to us. So it's either d5 or e3. Something else I'll mention about this line is that when white plays with something like bishop g5, he's not likely to play e4. If he plays e4, he usually leaves the bishop on c1, because if he goes e4 here, then that bishop on g5 is not well placed. When white plays the bishop g5 system, usually he places the pawn on e3. Here we can play in a Maroczy-bind fashion as black, something like queen a5, attacking the bishop. When we play queen a5, we are also threatening to play knight takes e4. There's a pin, so again, not the best line for white. Queen a5 I think is good, so is knight c6, because here we play knight c6, we've got all sorts of threats, such as knight takes e4, queen a5, again, maybe queen b6, attacking the knight and the pawn. We can tell white has a lot of issues, because the minute he plays bishop g5, the pawn on b2 is no longer protected. So here after c5, let's get to the main lines, and before we analyze both d5 and e3, let's also mention two other moves we have to analyze. Bishop takes f6, I think this is probably a positional blunder, because now we simply play bishop takes, now we get the bishop pair. Unless white does something quick, then we're simply much better, because we'll take on d4, we'll play knight c6, and there's nothing white can do against our bishop pair in the open position. And if he goes knight e4, looks like a nice try from white, because he attacks our bishop on f6 and our pawn on c5. However, we've got queen a5 here. He has to cover the check on d2, and he ends up losing a pawn. After queen takes d2, we play bishop takes d4 next, and there's not enough compensation for white. Alright, last but not least, if he plays queen d2, let's say he goes for the online variation, queen d2, bishop h6. Here, since we're attacking the center right away, I don't think white has time to go for something like this. That's just too risky. Here we can simply take, he's going to take with a knight, we can play knight c6, and now cannot even play bishop h6 here, because we'll simply take and then we play knight takes e4. That queen is overloaded. So after takes, knight takes d4, knight c6, let's see if white can somehow get his kingside attack going. If he plays e3, well, can no longer play bishop h6 here, and after e3 we can play a plan we'll mention in a minute. I don't want to spoil anything, but we can try something like knight takes d4 and d5, or we can just play d6 and we can play standard bishop d7, rook c8, sorry. I think taking on d4 followed by d5 is better, because we are likely to play against an isolated pawn. So after e3, he no longer has the kingside attack. What else? If he goes knight c2, then we can simply play d6, and now we'll have a quick development. We'll attack way before he gets his bishop h6 done. If he insists on attacking, then we can just ignore him by playing bishop e6 and rook c8. I think bishop f5 might be even stronger, because we put an eye on knight c2. So essentially his kingside attack won't happen. Bishop f5 is the move I like. The engine goes for the aggressive bishop takes, and after queen takes, it recommends both bishop e6 and knight e5. The thing is, even if he goes h4, h5, that's way too slow. We've got ways to deal with that. And I think we will attack way before he manages to threaten checkmate. So let's say he goes h4 here. Now the engine goes for the ruthless knight takes c4, which is probably fine. I don't see any risk. If he goes h5, have to realize there's not even a checkmate threat yet, because if he takes, we take with the f pawn, and h7 is protected by our knight. So here knight takes b2 or even queen b6 both look crushing. What I would do, just to be careful and just to make sure we don't allow any counterplay, instead of knight takes c4, which is an engine-like move, I would go queen b6, because now on top of queen takes b2, we've got threats such as queen takes f2, followed by knight g4, and we just win. So for instance, let's say it goes rook b1, here it's just take, king takes, knight g4, we get the queen back, we are up a pawn, and we are simply winning. So, in a nutshell, we can tell White cannot go for something like this. He needs a better development in order to attack. And this illustrates the point what I mentioned earlier. If he goes for something like this, like an express kingside attack, that's not likely to work because we always have resources. If he goes h4, h5, he takes on g6, can always take back with the f7 pawn. We've got rook f7. That is the worst case scenario. In the meantime, we'll counter-attack on the queen side, and here we've got a powerful development, and I think it's not recommended for White to go for a kingside attack. There's one more line that comes to mind. For some reason, I'm thinking about this. After d6 here, let's say he goes this. I think that's way too risky because now we can have basically two bishops targeting the queen side, that we can go for a pawn storm there. For some reason I was thinking about this move, queen b6, targeting the b2 pawn. Let's say he goes e3, which is careless, then I can play knight e4. And after knight takes, there's queen takes b2, checkmate. Otherwise, I'll just take the bishop on g5. Don't ask me why, but for some reason I was thinking about this line as I was analyzing the other one. So many lines we can consider here. So after c5, now we can analyze the main lines for White. And those are e3, and the other one is going for d5, which would be the Benoni line we are trying to get as Black. I say Benoni because we'll play with a pawn on c5, and we're likely to play with a pawn on d6. So let's see what happens if he plays e3. So here we've got a lot of ideas to play as Black. I like the simple c takes d4, and White has to take, well, he can take with queen, knight, or pawn. Usually he takes with the pawn. If he takes with the queen, that's not a great idea because we'll play knight c6, we'll simply get our pieces out, and we're just fine. If he takes with the knight, that looks a bit careless because his bishop on g5 is usually hanging, so knight c6, we've got ideas based on queen a5 and knight e4, so it doesn't look right. We can also transpose into a line we mentioned earlier, which is here, queen d2, knight takes d4 and d5. We'll see something like that soon. So White after e3, c takes d4, he's more than likely to take with the pawn. Because he gets the center, he'll play bishop e2, he'll castle, and it is fair to say he's doing slightly better if he gets to keep this powerful center. However, after e takes d4, here's where Black can play d5. So now, all of a sudden, we play in a Grunfeld approach, and this gambit pays off. Let's see why. The reason is White, his kingside is yet to be developed. He has to finish his kingside development, and after d5, we're attacking the center right away. We have to play with initiative when we play the King's Indian. We don't have to be concerned about sacrificing a pawn, especially if sacrificing a pawn means attacking and getting the initiative. So after d5, let's see what White can play here. And let's start off with let's call it basic moves. C takes d5, I think this is a mistake, because we simply play knight takes d5, and now what we get is an isolated pawn to play against. This is perfect, because we've got no weaknesses as Black, White has no targets, and as Black will have an easy game playing against White's isolated pawn. We know against the isolated pawn, the idea is to blockade it. We've done that already because we've got the knight on d5. If we can get an endgame. If we can trade pieces off, that's perfect, because that pawn on d4 will be a weakness when we play the endgame. So here, let's say he goes bishop d3. Now black is already better after knight c6. So white castles. Now we have to be careful because we don't have all of our pieces out yet. So we could play knight takes d4. We might have some tactics here. What I would do, just to be careful, is bishop g4. I can deal with that pawn later. Or I can go something like knight c7. That pawn there is in trouble. I don't see how white can protect that pawn. We've got too many pieces attacking that pawn on d4, and in fact that pawn on d4 is likely to fall. So this is just a sample line. I think taking on d5 is simply bad for white. The same goes after knight takes d5. You can simply take, and his king's still in the center. Whenever he takes on e7, we've got rook e8. So here, by the time he castles, we'll manage to take his pawn on d4. So taking on d5, not a good approach from white. If he plays c5, that would be okay if he had a good kingside development. Problem is, he still got the king in the center. So here we can play knight c6, and then we can try something like knight e4. And that bishop on g5 is in limbo. So let's say he goes bishop d3. Well, for starters, we might still be able to play knight e4, because at the end of the day we've got a lot of pieces targeting his pawn on d4. Even better, we can play bishop g4. How is white, protecting his pawn on d4? I don't see a way other than bishop e2, so he has to move the bishop back. And then we can play knight e4. The same goes if he goes bishop e3, by the way. So here we'll attack the pawn on d4, bishop takes f3, knight takes d4, f5. We've got a big advantage here because we've got more space. On top of that, we've got threats such as bishop takes f3, knight takes d4. Honestly, I don't see how white can stop all of this. If he takes, we take the pawn, and we add more pieces to the d4 pressure. So we can see his bishop on g5 doesn't make any sense. In fact, that bishop is helping us when we play knight e4, when we create all of this counterplay. So after d5, it's either accepting the challenge, playing bishop takes f6, or playing, let's say, something like bishop e2 or bishop d3. And that means playing with an isolated pawn, because sooner or later we'll take, and then white has a pawn on d4, which is, in my opinion, a weakness. So here, after bishop e2, in the analysis you'll find knight e4, which is powerful. Bishop e6 looks pretty good as well, because we threaten to take on c4. If he takes, we play knight takes. If he plays c5, we can play knight e4. So here, what is likely to happen is we'll get a position where white has a weakness, we've got no weaknesses, and we'll simply play against that isolated pawn on d4. So essentially here, after analyzing all of these lines, after bishop g5, takes, d5, the move white has to play is bishop takes f6. He has to accept the challenge and give his bishop pair away. At least he'll get a pawn out of it, because he'll take the pawn on d5. So after bishop takes f6, we'll take, and here white has, of course, two ways to go. Knight takes d5 and c takes d5. I think knight takes d5 looks better, because after knight takes d5 he's at least caring about his pawn structure. Let's see c takes d5 first. So after c takes d5, remember what I said about the king's Indian. We have to play with the initiative. Here we've got the bishop pair, we're attacking, he's got the king in the center, so let's just play e6. If If he takes on e6, great. We'll play bishop takes, we'll play knight c6, and we know we'll get that pawn back. There's nothing white can do to stop it. He wants to stop knight c6, we'll play a6 and b5. And he'll have to move the bishop back. If he plays, let's say he goes bishop e2, well, we'll play knight c6. Still got a lot of counterplay going on. d5 is not working, because we play bishop takes. So here we get, after both queen takes or bishop takes, is an endgame where he's got a weakness on c3. And we've got a solid pawn structure, so we are slightly better. So after c takes d5 here, takes, c takes d5, e6, taking on e6 is not good. It's actually helping us. So maybe bishop c4, trying to hold onto that extra pawn. Well, we'll take, we'll play knight takes d5, we play rook e8 check. Now king f1 is not going to work. In fact, after king f1, I don't mind playing bishop g7. I'm down a pawn, he's down a king and a rook. So that's definitely much better for us. So what he'll do is knight e3. Here we play knight c6, and I think our bishop pair gives us the advantage. The main line, according to the engine, is playing queen b3. Then we can play queen a5 check. He has to play king f1. This is not great looking for white. I think this is might be equal according to the engines. In practice, I think white is toast, because here he cannot take the pawn on f7. He cannot play with the king on f1. He's likely to make a mistake sooner or later. For instance, if he takes on f7, I quite like rook f8 because he's got the king on the same file. Rook e7 is apparently stronger at this position. Again, I think white will end up making a mistake at some point. Look at our pieces. We'll get bishop c8 out, we'll play rook f8, and this is this is real compensation, and there's no reason for white to play a position like this for just a pawn. White is up a pawn, that he's down, as we mentioned earlier, a king and a rook. So these are the lines we're trying to get when we play this gambit, this c5 and d5 line as black. So yeah, white has to go for the knight takes d5 line here. So coming back to, let's go all the way, bishop g5, c5, e3, takes, d5, bishop takes, knight takes d5. Here we'll simply play bishop to g7. Problem for white is his upper pawn, however, will play knight c6, we'll play bishop g4. We've got e6 in the mix as well, and we are going to get the pawn back. There's no way for white to keep his extra pawn. If he had something like c3 available, then maybe. Since he's got that pawn on c4, his bishop on f1 is not great, and his pawn on d4 cannot be protected. There's not much he can do against our bishop pair. So that is great news. We'll get the pawn back. Even if we didn't, I think we're doing great, because the bishop pair is more than enough compensation in the middle game, even end games. So here white could play something like bishop e2, and I think bishop e2 is better than bishop d3, because bishop g4 is always annoying. But here we'll play knight c6. Now if he moves knight e5 away, we'll simply take the pawn on d4. We get an endgame with the bishop pair, and here we'll still get that if he moves knight e5 away. If he doesn't, let's say he plays rook c1, what we'll get is a position with opposite color bishops, and this is something that happens all the time in the King's Indian. When we get a position like this with opposite color bishops, we have to pay attention to the side that's attacking. Remember this concept. This is not an openings concept, this is a middle games concept. When you got opposite color bishops, the attacking side has the advantage. Why? Because here, for instance, we're attacking and there's not much white can do to handle dark squares. Imagine we had our queen here and maybe we do a battery or something. There's no dark squares bishop for white, so it'll be a challenge for him to defend here. Not to mention that we've got the outpost on d4, we'll play e6, we'll kick that knight back from d5. So there's queenside pressure, there's a lot of things going on for black here, and we'll keep the giant on d4. White, on the other hand, has to move that knight d5 back. That's not great. Not great for him, of course. So, what else can white do here? After knight takes d5, bishop g7, bishop e2, we saw that. We can easily get the pawn back. I found a game where white played knight e3, which is a smart way of getting the knight out of d5. He stops bishop g4. So it feels like he might keep his extra pawn, but as we know, this is all about initiative. This is all about our bishop pair and development. So we play knight c6. Now he has to play d5, otherwise we'll simply take. If he goes knight c2, we can add more pressure with bishop g4 or bishop f5. So he goes d5, and here I found a game where black played with a lot of tactics and played bishop takes b2. We'll see that. There's an easier move, I believe, if we don't want to, let's say this is a blitz game and we don't have time to analyze specific lines. In that case, queen a5 looks great, because if he goes queen d2, we can trade everything off and we take the pawn on b2 at the end. Or, even better, we can just take it now. He cannot take because of the pin, and if he moves the rook away, we play bishop c3, winning the game. So here, we get the pawn back, we get an endgame, we get the bishop pair, he's got the worst bishop. So essentially, we get a clear advantage. It's black with queen a5. In this game, after d5, black goes for bishop takes b2, maybe knight e5 as well. Worst case scenario will always have compensation. Black goes all in here, taking on b2. White takes on c6. If he plays rook b1, then we've got bishop c3 check. So he takes. Here, since he's got the king in the center, we're not going to trade queens off. We'll play queen a5. Now queen d2 runs into bishop c3. King e2 loses to rook d8. And then he'll have to play with the king on e2. And if he goes knight to d2, here we could take the rook. There's no rush though, because he's still got the king in the center. So here we can add even more threats, such as bishop c3 or taking on d2, rook takes d2, followed by bishop c3, and that is a crushing advantage for black. As usual, let's pay attention to development and initiative. If he takes on b7, all the better for us, because we'll add another piece to the attack. If he goes rook b1, we take, and then bishop c3. This is what usually happens in the King's Indian. This line illustrates that point very well. We usually want to get an attack out of the opening. So what happened in the game, I believe it was knight d5. Yeah, knight d5. Black took on a1. Queen takes, and here, after the simple pawn takes, we'll end up winning, because if he plays knight takes e7, we simply got king f8. There's no counterplay for white, and queen takes d2 comes next. And if he plays knight c3, well, he won't make it to safety, because knight d2 is always hanging. I think queen a3 is the best line here. I do remember the game because of the ideas, not because I memorized it move by move. And that's, I think, the approach we have to use when we study lines as well. Here, all I remember is d5, he takes on f6, I come back with my bishop to g7, and then I'll try finding a lot of counterplay as soon as I can. That's all I need to know. Here, I know his king is in a bad situation, and eventually I'll punish him. He won't make it to safety, because again that knight is hanging, and a potential line could be knight b3. I keep on adding pieces to the attack, and then he's losing. So, as you can see, a lot of lines already in this sub-line with the g5. I think this is a good line to start our King's Indian journey, because we get to see a lot of the ideas we want to play as black. The first idea we see is that not always we have to play with d6 and e5. Sometimes we can play in a Benoni approach. By the way, for the next chapter, we'll see what happens if he plays d5. We saw positions where we play against the isolated pawn. I think the most important concept is that in the King's Indian, with this chapter, we saw that we can play a lot of lines with the initiative and sacrificing a pawn. That's what I like about the King's Indian, to create imbalances right from the get-go. So hopefully we'll keep on analyzing and illustrating this point in future chapters. For now, we'll finish this one here. I hope you found this useful. I hope you could learn something. And of course, I want to see you guys on the next video. Thank you.